So you could consider this Stussy for Straw Hat propaganda, but I got some interesting things to point out. So it was recently revealed in the last Vivicar drop. I did an hour video on that. Go check that out. But it was revealed that the clone Stussy that we know was born on the lab ship of Mads. This is super interesting because one, we've kind of seen the development and the relationship between her and Mads throughout the story. As one of the things she does during the Tea Party is that she presumably assassinates Lufeld or Dufeld, who was seen as the primary benefactor of Mads when they were a free agent organization. So it's very funny that she ends up killing the man that was the benefactor for her creation. I'm just saying that's a little odd. On top of that, and how this relates to Frankie, is that many people have speculated that the ship that Frankie comes across when he's set adrift in the ocean after being run over by the sea train is the abandoned ship of Mads. This was the ship that he used to rebuild himself into a cyborg. So you could say that this ship has led to the birth of two characters, and all of their parents come from this ship. As Buckingham Stussy, Stussy's mother, which makes Stussy Stussy Jr., which is odd, but Buckingham Stussy was a part of Mads and was primarily used for the cloning experiment that Vegapunk conducted. And based on Stussy's relationship with Vegapunk in the Egghead Island arc, you could say that Vegapunk kinda is her dad. And now we know that Queen, also known as Cyan, is the father of Cuddy Flam, also known as Frankie, or at least is presumed to be his dad. So all of that is very interesting. What's also interesting, and this could just be a convenient place setting, but I find it very peculiar that Stussy is adept at the six powers, and we first learn about the six powers during the time in which Frankie is the star of the show, both in Water 7 and Enies Lobby. So that too in itself is quite interesting. But with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Paula Pete. What's it? So many are familiar with Rouge the Bat from the Sonic the Hedgehog series. I often wondered why she was often put in the same category as Tails in some video games. Now the obvious answer is that she can fly like Tails, but I think there may be another reason. You see, Rouge the Bat's design could be inspired by a real-world bat known as the flying fox. The flying fox is a huge bat species that has a very canine-shaped head. Unlike, say, the vampire bat, it is a herbivore, so it only eats fruits. And I thought that was very interesting and kind of a pun in a way, because Tails is a two-tailed fox and Rouge is a bat that could be based off an animal called a flying fox. So yeah, give me your thoughts. Are you familiar with the character Morgan Ainsland? Morgan Ainsland is a succubus from the video game series known as Darkstalkers by Capcom. She is attributed to being the origin point for Japan's fascination with succubi, as she popularized the concept. Even though she wasn't the first, she is the most popular. With that being said, you see many succubi in various Japanese media, and I think you're going to see it in One Piece, and the characters that you see on the Straw Hat crew in One Piece are going to very well match how Morgan is presented in Darkstalkers. Because the funny thing about Morgan is that she has a clone slash daughter slash lost piece of her soul called Lilith. So in Darkstalkers, there are two succubi. One is named Lilith and one is named Morgan, with Lilith being the clone. How this comes back into One Piece is that I think Stussy is going to join the crew alongside Robin. These characters are very similar in a lot of ways because I think they play upon the ideal of the practical and the literal versus the figurative and the fanciful that we've seen in various members before. For example, Frankie, like Stussy, was an antagonist. But Frankie in his relationship with Luffy is very similar because one, they both wear red. Frankie just has a more fanciful version of what Luffy wears. And two, everything Luffy does is named after a weapon, but there is no weapon present. He is punching most of the time, right? So when it comes to Frankie, he literally has those weapons within his body. Everything he does is actually real. Also, Luffy is able to inflate his body and has a move called Tank Man when he achieves Gear 4th, right? Well, Frankie also inflates and he actually turns into a tank of sorts. But there's a practical reason behind both of those abilities. They're both done through engineering, whereas Luffy's abilities are done due to the powers of his Devil Fruit. So on one side, you have a practical character who then copies the abilities of the impractical character. And then two, Luffy is known for stretching out his arms, and Frankie can stretch out his arm as well. But while Luffy stretches out his arms due to being made of rubber due to the powers of his Devil Fruit, Frankie stretches out his arm because it is an engineered part of his body. It is a fist attached to a chain that is built into the base of his forearm. So that is the practical versus the fanciful, the literal versus the figurative. With Robin and Stussy, you have a very similar relationship because while Stussy is a clone of Buckingham Stussy, much like how Lilith is a clone of Morgan, Robin's ability is to figuratively make clones of her body parts and herself. These are not real constructs, as they have a direct line to her. When they are damaged, she is damaged, and they can be spawned and whisked away with a thought, whereas Stussy literally is her own being and her own person. Continuing with that, due to the powers of the Bat Fruit, you could say Stussy literally is a succubus and does succubus-like things, as she does train the life force of both two men, Kaku and Lucy. However, Robin is a figurative succubus because she takes the visions of a succubus during her fight with Black Maria, in which she uses her flower fruit powers to take the form of a succubus. And she is figuratively the holder of the epithet demon child, but she is neither a demon nor a child at this point in the story. So that is what I'm saying. You have the literal succubus in Stussy versus the figurative succubus in Robin. So much like in Darkstalkers, I think on the Straw Hat crew, you will have these two women present, both being succubi, but one being a figurative succubus and the other one being a literal succubus. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works. Polypede Works here. So I have been a very avid Kara supporter for a very long time on this channel. However, my allegiances must swing in a different direction because as of 1115, we see Carrot on Zoe. So she actually did go back to Zoe, which probably means that the Carrot agenda is dead. I'm so sorry, boys. I'm so sorry. I've been holding out for a very long time because we did not know where she was. But when proof comes, you have to accept it. And seeing her on Zoe most likely means that she is out of the narrative for now, and she will not join the main crew. That's a shame. Kind of sad about it, had high expectations for her, but there is hope on the horizon for another character. That character being Stussy. Now, this is coming to mind after the events of chapter 1115 and the events of 1116, in which some very interesting character development type things do happen for Stussy that give you the feeling that she's a character in some ways like Robin was. And we're going to get to that in a little bit because there are a lot of weird parallels that she has with Robin that I didn't expect to find, but yeah, I'm very surprised by what I have seen. So let's get into it. So before we start theorizing, let's talk about what has happened recently in 1115 and 1116. So in 15, we see that Stussy has some trepidation about her existence now because all of what she has done, presumably her entire career as a character up to this point in the narrative, has been for Vegapunk Stella. And now that he is gone, she feels aimless in her existence. This then translates into the next chapter, 1116, in which Edison is talking to her and apologizes on behalf of Vegapunk, who he is technically. It's very weird, but he apologizes on the behalf of Vegapunk, stating that, "I'm sorry that you had to betray all those in CP0 who you see as friends, but because you found it in your heart to still work for us and do things on the behalf of Vegapunk himself and the Straw Hats without significantly maiming your former co-workers, that shows you that you are indeed a human and you need to go on living. Do as you please." And then Stussy says, "Yes, sir." So from that, we can gather that this is very similar to other sort of Straw Hat mentor send-offs. What comes to mind and what's very, I guess, on point due to the topics of this video is when Tom gives Frankie his send-off in saying that, "Don't be ashamed of the things you make. Appreciate all that you have made with gusto." So it seems like this is a very similar situation. Or, to be even more on point, is very much like when Saul tells Robin to go off and find friends and keep on living. The situation is very similar too, because when Robin is escaping, the island of O'Hara is being Buster called for discovering information about the Void Century. Much like here in Egghead, Egghead Island is being Buster called for Vegapunk researching things about the Void Century. So the parallels cannot be ignored here, especially when Edison is an extension of Vegapunk. So it's much like Stussy's father, presumably, talking to her and telling her to go on, to keep living, to escape this situation. Much like how Saul, who acted like a sort of parental figure in a way to her at that time, who then tells her to go off, keep living, live your dreams, and discover the true history of this world. So these situations are very similar. And what kind of wrapped this entire thing up is that Saul, who was presumed dead, is found out to be alive in this very arc, the Egghead arc. So that even further strengthens the parallels here. But now that we've covered recent events, I think it's important to talk about Stussy's nature and how much like a Straw Hat she actually is. However, in order to do that, I think it's important to go over each and every Straw Hat and tell you why they're important and what they brought to the table upon entering the story. Because what people don't really talk about is that each time a Straw Hat has been introduced, except for one time, we have gotten something completely new and interesting in the story that wasn't there before. So, for example, with Luffy, he is our first Dough Fruit Eater in the story narratively. He introduces us to the rules of Dough Fruits and what happens once you eat one. Following that, we have characters like Zoro. Zoro, being the user of the three sword style, is unique because he is the only user of that style in the world. It's an inventive style that he himself made. On top of that, we are introduced to the world of swordsmen in a way, because upon him meeting Mihawk, we understand now that Zoro is striving to be the greatest swordsman in the world. But beforehand, we had no idea that there was a swordsman hierarchy of sorts. Following that, we have Nami. Nami has the ability to sense the weather, which is a very unique ability that only she has. And through her, we are constantly introduced to the importance of navigation and poses. Various types of poses throughout the entirety of the story. She is always there to be a holder or to introduce a type of navigation as the story calls for it. After her, we have Usopp. Usopp introduces us to the world of sharpshooting and gunslinging. He is the son of a red-haired pirate Yasopp, who is also an experienced gunman. But through Usopp, we are introduced to a world of sharpshooting and how important sharpshooting can be. Following him, we have Sanji. Now, to be fair, Sanji's importance comes way later, but what's interesting about him is that he is a Germa mutant. He is the first of his kind in the story, because beforehand we weren't really privy to mutants existing, and he's even more important amongst his siblings because he has the ability to feel, and on top of that, he has the ability to repair himself. Whether those two things are intertwined with one another, we do not know, but I think it's something very important to find out, because after that, we get even more mutants in the story in the form of the Seraphim. Moving on from that, we have Chopper. Chopper is our gateway into true Zoan mechanics in the narrative, because it is through him that we find out that even though Zoans do have 3 forms, this rule is not set in stone and can be broken through the use of Chopper's Rumble Ball. He is also the first animal in the story to have eaten a devil fruit. He is regarded as a freak because of this, especially when you consider not many characters are animals that eat human fruits throughout the story. So far, there have only been 2, and seeing as how the nature of devil fruits are usually one of a kind, he is the only animal that has eaten a normal human fruit. Following him, we have Robin. Robin is unique because due to her introduction as a main character, she alone raises the narrative ceiling of One Piece, because One Piece is no longer just a hunt for a treasure. It has become an archaeological expedition, because you need someone like Robin who can read the poneglyphs in order to find the treasure. This was an unknown aspect before she entered the story, and it's because of her we now find out the importance of history and poneglyphs, which becomes an even bigger deal, even when things aren't necessarily related to the treasure itself as we move forward. Following her, we have Frankie. Frankie's another really big character because he heightens the technological ceiling of One Piece as a whole. Before him, we had no idea that there were such things as cyborgs present within the story. We have had people like Crocodile or Zeph who simply replace their limbs with other attachments, but never before have we seen a fully cybernetic man. And from his introduction, the technology of One Piece keeps going higher and higher, but he is actually the official start. Following him, we have Brook. Brook is a very interesting case because I don't think a lot of people think about this, but Brook's existence heightens the devil fruit ceiling exponentially, because before him, devil fruit powers were weird, but they weren't as esoteric as his is, because what his does is that it allows him to cheat death, come back, and then have a ton of other abilities after the time skip, which go into even more very strange metaphysical aspects, like the ability to control soul, because his soul beats on a different wavelength than everyone else's, and he can create cryokinesis and all these other types of things. And I would say him being the poster boy for the entirety of Thriller Bark, because it's actually Thriller Bark that really starts to do this, because Moria is in the same situation as he removes a concept from a person, turns it into a matter, and then without this concept being attached to a person, if they are caught in sunlight, the world erases them. This is the first time in which a devil fruit power is connected to existence erasure in the narrative, which I find very important and very fascinating, because before this, there were no abilities that were bound to the realities of the One Piece world. Though Brook and Moria are the poster boys for that, which is why I say Brook is very important. And then Piranha is more or less the same thing, because never before have we had a devil fruit that affects a person's mental and emotional state. That is also a unique and important thing. On top of that, there hadn't been a devil fruit before that summoned familiars that could be connected to the user. That too is another important aspect. So I say Brook, and by extension Thriller Bark, completely and totally raise the devil fruit ceiling and what devil fruits are actually able to do. This sort of weird, nearly reality warping bits of abilities that now exist in the world. It's even stranger because Brook is the only person in his position, most likely, who literally is a skeleton. And yet, despite being a skeleton, he can exist as a normal human. That too is why Brook is important and why Brook is unique. The only character so far that has not done any of these things for One Piece as a whole is Jinbei. There will be another video about Jinbei specifically, but as far as I know, Jinbei doesn't have these sort of world heightening or in-depth lore aspects that the others have. The most I can say about Jinbei is that through his existence, we do have a formal explanation of how Fishman Karate works. So, what does all this have to do with Stussy? Well, Stussy has a lot of firsts in the narrative, and she also covers something that we have not really gone over that much so far, but has existed in a number of arcs since Alabasta. So she is the first human clone in history. She is a clone of former Rocks pirate and former Mads member Buckingham Stussy. So in being the first clone in history, she supersedes all other clone experiments after her. She's more important than the Germa clones. She's more important than the satellites. She's more important than the Seraphim, because she is the first clone in history. This is important, and this makes her a unique creature like many people on the Straw Hat crew. Another thing, it is highly implied that she is the first artificial devil fruit user in history, because in chapter 1172, the reason why this chapter is important is because we find out a lot about Stussy in this chapter. The nature of what she is revealed once the chapter begins, and at the end, her powers are revealed when she knocks out Kaku and Lucy. Now, this is important because this is also the same chapter in which we have the Mads cover story. In said entry of the Mads cover story, we see Caesar Clown, Queen, and Vince Smoke Judge all younger as members of Mads. And we see their three specialties. Judge and his weird spear, which really doesn't have much to do with him going forward, but whatever, he does use a spear in the future. We see Queen and his chemicals, probably him starting his fascination with diseases and plagues. And then we have Caesar Clown holding a devil fruit. Said devil fruit is a unique devil fruit, as I've said in videos before, because this devil fruit has the O's of an artificial devil fruit, but it has the curly stem of a normal devil fruit, which means that based on what we see in the chapter, it is very likely that Stussy is the holder now of this unique artificial devil fruit, because Occam's razor would suggest if all of this is happening in the same chapter, this devil fruit was put here for a reason. We start the chapter off with the devil fruit being revealed, and then we end the chapter with the devil fruit in use, presumably. This still has not been confirmed, but just simply connecting the dots is the conclusion I have come to. She is the user of this fruit. I did a entire video on it, but I presume that this fruit is an artificial devil fruit that contains the power of a vampire bat, not the mythical creature, but a normal vampire bat. And this is revealed even a little bit more so in the anime adaptation of this chapter. But for more information on that, please go watch my video on the fruit that I made. There'll be a link to that in this video. However, moving on, the thing that I think is what's going to make Stussy important and heighten the ceiling of One Piece yet again in terms of narrative is her connection to the underworld. You see, the underworld is a huge crime network that we have been fed piecemeal throughout the story, as early as Alabasta, because dance powder is a black market item sold in the underworld. However, we have also had a member on the crew who is associated with the underworld in Frankie, but based on what we see from him, he was simply a man who knew how to access the market, not someone who's been a part of any significant portion of the underworld as a whole. Stussy, however, is an emperor of the pleasure corner, whatever that entails of. So with her being a member of the Straw Hat crew, this could then open the door to the importance of the underworld as a aspect in the narrative, because we've seen it so many times without any real formal explanation about how it works or who's in it. I have to give some credit, however, to Discord member and big One Piece community member in general, Mr. Bushido, because Mr. Bushido, though I have to apologize to him because I am jumping ship from the Carrot Train. He's been a big Carrot supporter, but he did make something very apparent to me, that the underworld seems to have some sort of CP0 like tendencies, because during the demonstration of Smiley and Shinokuni, we see a very odd man with a bird headdress on his head. It's like this big black bird like headdress, and that says to me that potentially, as Mr. Bushido said too, that there could be some strange hierarchy or organization within the underworld like there is in CP0, because as you know, in CP0, the high-ranking members wear masks. This is also a possible callback, again, much like I think how the CP0 thing developed, to the masks present in Water 7. But I said all this to say that I think Stussy is going to be our door into the inner workings of the underworld, or more underworld activities, seeing as how she was a big wig in the underworld and not just a common buyer like most of the characters that we have seen have been. Like Doflamingo was just a product supplier, the Crocodile was a buyer, Frankie was a buyer, etc., etc. But she, being intimate with the inner workings of it, will most likely be our gateway into it. And that is why I think she is important, because she offers something that not many characters so far have. Moving forward, however, we should start talking about the weird similarities between Stussy and Robin in the narrative, because much like how Robin makes a surprise cameo appearance in Frankie's flashback through Tom slamming down her Wanda poster on the desk, we see Stussy appear in the joint flashback of Kuma and Bonnie. This is very interesting too, because what Stussy says in the flashback really does relate back to what's going on in the present. Even after all this time has passed from the flashback into present day, she still has some very unresolved feelings about her existence as someone else's clone, as she compares her own humanity to Kuma eventually losing his, saying how it's a travesty, you're going to lose something that I never really had, which is kind of nuts. And I think is what is going to be her character arc moving forward if she does become a main character. Another interesting thing to point out is that when Frankie has his flashback and when we see Robin in his flashback, it's very interesting that during the Ennis Lobby arc, the two of them are paired up quite often. And much like the arc we're having now, it is an arc in which we're dealing with the government, depths of the government, actually, because CP9 is a secret organization within the world government. We're dealing with CP9 and we're dealing with Rob, Lucy, and Kaku. Much like in Egghead, we're dealing with an even deeper organization within the world government in which we're dealing with Cypher, Poe, Aegis Zero. And then we have, again, Kaku and Lucy, who act as not main antagonists, but smaller antagonists in this arc. So going off of that and looking at Ennis Lobby, I think it's very likely, seeing as how we have Frankie join and Robin rejoin at the same time, I think it's quite likely, like back then, we're going to have two people join at the same time. Most likely Bonnie and Stussy. Perhaps even Bonnie will put in a good word for Stussy, seeing as how she knows about Stussy based on viewing Kuma's memories via the bubble he left behind. What would be also very interesting is that Stussy acts as a stowaway during the escape on the Thousand Sunny, much like how Robin was introduced when the crew was leaving Alabasta. Very, very high possibility, especially when you consider that Alabasta is starting to play a role, even though it's a very small role, in the Egghead arc. Because, of course, we have the topic of Pluton and the ancient weapons coming up, and the directions of where to find Pluton were located in Alabasta. So it's a very, very interesting web of connections that start to come up. But continuing with the comparisons between Robin and Stussy, it's very interesting that the antagonists of Ennis Lobby are regarded as friends to Stussy, now an Egghead, which is just a small tidbit, but another really bigger part of their connection is that Stussy's father, Vegapunk, was helped immensely by basically all the father figures in Robin's life. Both Clover and Saul aided in various ways to Vegapunk finding out about the nature of the world, because Clover was the guy who went around the world and built this great library in O'Hara. When O'Hara burned down, it was Saul who saved and rescued all the books to be put in a library in Elbaf, which is where Vegapunk started to research. So it's quite funny how the fathers of these two women are so intertwined together. Going off of that, just talking about powers, it's also very interesting that Robin's flower fruit and her ultimate technique so far is in the form of a succubus or a big demon-like woman, right? Whereas with Stussy, when she reveals herself to be a Delphi user, she grows bat wings and looks like a succubus, much like how Robin looks in her Black Maria fight. And I just wanted to point that out because that's a very interesting concept. Another thing they have in common is that the two are both assassins in a way. Robin's specialty was assassination, which is how she introduced herself to Usopp. And then, of course, Stussy, her ability is assassination as well. And she actually exercises this as she does seemingly off Lufeld during the Tea Party, which makes a lot of sense because the six powers were always a tool for assassination. Now, you consider her role in the crew and what her position may be. I think I have an idea, and this is basically ripping out some of the notes that I have had and some people in the community have had on Carrot joining and applying it to Stussy because I think it fits rather well. You see, when talking about Stussy and Bonnie, I think some important aspects of their character and how they exist in One Piece is based off of gags shown in the SBS. For Bonnie, for example, there's been a gag in the SBS for a few years now about how characters will look in good or bad timelines once they get older. Bonnie's whole ability is just that gag. So if she does indeed join the crew, Oda can use that gag freely because now that's a canonical ability. On that topic too, you remember how we talked about how Brook raised the Devil Fruit ceiling? Bonnie is that as well, because never before have we had a Devil Fruit that can pull out possibilities in a timeline and bring them to the forefront. Just in concept, that's crazy. But I digress. I did do a separate video on what position I think Bonnie would play if she joined the crew. There should be a link right now about that. Where Stussy comes into this is that all the Straw Hats in SBSs have revealed to have times in which they go to sleep. Stussy, based on my analysis, is most likely a vampire bat zoan, which means she's a nocturnal creature, which means she would stay up during most of the night. Therefore, I think instead of Carrot being a lookout, Stussy might indeed be our lookout because she can fly, and thanks to the anime, we know that she has infrared vision, which is a bit more ideal than anyone else that we've seen with sight powers in the story. Another very helpful bat ability in conjunction with infrared vision that Stussy may have is that vampire bats in the real world can use echolocation, in which they emit a high frequency sound. That high frequency sound bounces off an object, and that sound then returns to the bat. So in this situation, Stussy could perhaps let out a high frequency sound. It bounces off an enemy ship several kilometers away. The sound comes back to her, and then she knows what's exactly in the area. What also could lend to her being a lookout is that she, much like Lucy and Kaku have done in the past, is hiding in plain sight. So she has been a spy. And we don't know what the Pleasure District entails of, because she was the queen of the Pleasure District at the time, which is her sort of realm of the underworld. But I would assume that it has something to do with info brokering, because I would think many high class clients come to her for particular activities, and people who she is in charge of probably tell her things that they have told them, and she uses that information as leverage against them. So you can kind of say that this goes back to being a lookout, because a lookout's main job is info gathering, and she would be doing just that, gathering info on clients. But moving on. Honestly, what better ability for a lookout to have than to see incoming threats through their vessels via their heat signature? That's better than anything else. And what is even more interesting about this is that she probably does have experience in scoping out threats or scoping out individuals if she was the vampire bat that gives all the warlords their invitations. We don't know if that's a confirmed thing yet, but I talk about it in my video about her being a vampire bat. So that's why I really think she is an ideal candidate to be a lookout, because she has a tool, thanks to the anime, that we know would be effective in scoping out threats. And I'm willing to bet, based on that being shown in the anime, it's going to be canon in the manga. And again, I go over this in my Stussy video about her being a vampire bat zoan. Moving forward, however, taking the time to go over some more miscellaneous information before we go over what I think her dream is going to be. I think her color is going to be white. Now, I know Brook is the only Straw Hat currently with 2 colors, and I've always said if he was going to lose one color to another character, it will most likely be white, seeing as how black represents him better, as his afro is such a significant part of his design and such a significant part of his character, seeing as how it's the only thing from his body that he has left. It's most likely that he'll be only represented by black. And you see this in a lot of promotional material. He's usually depicted in some sort of grayish purple or just straight up gray. He's never really represented by white. It's always something closer to black. So that's why I think his main color will be black, and Stussy's will be white because she's been represented by white through the entirety of the franchise so far. When she is undercover as an emperor of the underworld, she has a white hat. In CP0, she's wearing white, and her egghead design has white in it. So most likely her color will be white. Now, in terms of family position, I think these are going to get changed around again. And I think Frankie is going to lose his position currently as the grandmother, which is just weird to begin with. And that will most likely go to Stussy, because Stussy most likely would be the oldest female in the crew at that point, because I'm willing to bet, based on the timeline, she's most likely older than Robin, probably in her 40s. So I think that would make sense for her, which I think would be a very unique moment if Bonnie joins alongside her, because it would be much like how after Ennis Lobby, you have Robin rejoining and Frankie joining, and those two were both the oldest female and the oldest male member at that time. They represented the mother and father dynamic. Whereas with Stussy and Bonnie, you would have the youngest female character join the crew and the oldest female character join the crew. So in that way, they kind of make for a very interesting pair, like how Robin and Frankie did back in the day. So in thinking about Stussy and what her dream might be, I think her dream might be to see the truth of the world, to see the final result of what Vegapunk was researching. And in order to see that, it would make sense that she would be on a ship with a crew going after the One Piece, because the One Piece is the key to the truth of the world. Seeing as how Roger and the gang learned everything once they got to Laugh Tale and found the One Piece. So that's what I think her dream would be. And based on her struggles with the matters of her existence, this could also play a role in fulfilling her purpose as a person, because even though Vegapunk didn't see the outcome of the world, she saw it for him. So I guess you could say in that situation, she is the main holder of his will in that way. It would also be nice for her to come to terms with her being a person in her own right, just based on traveling around with the crew and having a found family who cares and appreciates her. And seeing as how there are so many freaks on the crew already, she may feel right at home, because even though you have people on the crew like Brooke who have lost everything of their humanity, they still have the will to move forward and press on. So if he can, she can. But I almost forgot. Some people may consider Stussy's reputation a problem and a barrier to her joining the crew. The fact of the matter is that even though she is an emperor of the underworld, and even though she is a high-ranking member in CP0, or at least a former high-ranking member in CP0, the fact of the matter is that she was never a pirate. She stays in her own niche. She stays in her own lane. She's not stepping on the toes of anybody else coming into the crew. This is usually the case with the majority of the members in the crew. Even those who were pirates have a considerably lower bounty or a lower reputation in comparison to the majority of the crew. This is true for Brooke, and this would be true for Bonnie if she joins, because her current bounty is very similar to, say, Nami's bounty. Even 300 million at this point doesn't really matter. The only exception to this that we have seen in the story so far is Jinbei, because in terms of reputation as a pirate, Jinbei is only second to Luffy. This is his third Yonko crew. He's been a pirate captain. He's been a warlord. Warlords, of course, are important. That's why there are several clones of them running around now. They are big figures on the world stage, and several characters in the story have reacted to Jinbei's presence. So being a warlord is a big deal. But with that being said, Stussy doesn't have the reputation as a pirate, making her much like, say, Robin, because even though Robin had a bounty before she joined, Robin had never been a part of a pirate organization before. Baroque Works, for example, is not a pirate organization. It was a mercenary organization ran by a pirate. So even though she was the highest ranking female member within that organization, she was never a pirate herself before joining the Straw Hat crew. And the reason why she had a bounty in the first place as a child was a information control attempt by the world government to snuff out the last person in the world who can read the poneglyphs. So her bounty was a lie. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Give me your thoughts. We talked a lot about Stussy today, but I really do like her as a character. Polypede works here. So, in One Piece episode 1104, we see that Stussy is all the offensive and she has the power of infrared vision. Now, I did a little bit of research and I found out that there's an actual bat in the real world that's a actual animal that has infrared vision in a bit of a roundabout way. The real life vampire bat does have the ability to sense in infrared through some weird nerves on its funny nose. These nerves help it to prey on warm-blooded creatures. Because as you know, vampire bats sort of scrape and lick blood from these warm-blooded creatures and they sap up the blood. So, with that being said, I think Stussy is actually a vampire bat Zoan. I don't think she's a normal Zoan, however. I think her fruit powers stem from an artificial dough fruit. And I guess she's kind of doing a victory lap for how many things you can put on her resume, because not only is she the first successful human clone in history, I think she's the first successful artificial dough fruit user in history. Because in the Mads cover story, we see Caesar Clown holding a weird dough fruit. However, this dough fruit does not look like a regular run-of-the-mill dough fruit, nor does it actually look like an artificial dough fruit as we know them now. No, it's a combination of the two, because a normal dough fruit usually has a curly stem, right? This dough fruit does have a curly stem, something that we have not seen from any other artificial dough fruit, whether that be Momonosuke's or the production line ones that the Totara were cultivating for Kaido, right? But what this does have in common with artificial dough fruits is that it has these sort of open circles all over its body, much like Momonosuke's dough fruit and then the production line dough fruits. So, what further gives credence to Stussy being the user of this supposed artificial vampire bat Zoan fruit is that in chapter 1072, in the Mads cover story, when the dough fruit is shown off, we also see on the first page Vegapunk telling us that he has created the first clone in human history. That clone is Stussy. So it's very peculiar that the dough fruit and the announcement of Stussy's nature are happening in the same chapter. But continuing on about the dough fruit, this is a very interesting object because it's the only one of its kind that we have seen in the series so far that has traits of both a normal dough fruit and an artificial dough fruit. The reason why, too, this doesn't get included in sort of like the fold of the dough fruit families is because artificial dough fruits, we find out, are actually cultivated from the lineage factors of normal animals. That's why you don't see anything too obtuse in a lot of the artificial dough fruits of, say, Kaido's army. The reason why, too, Momonosuke's dough fruit exists is because of the experiments done on the user of the original fish fruit model Azure Dragon, Kaido. So Momonosuke is the only dough fruit user who has a artificial dough fruit based off a mythical Zoan, whereas I think Stussy is the first artificial dough fruit user, bar none, just based on how unique and odd her supposed dough fruit is. which of course is the devil fruit that Caesar Clown is holding in the Mads cover story. On top of that, I know a lot of people might think that she is a vampire, which is a very funny coincidence that I just want to bring up because this has happened before, this sort of mythical real world animal comparison type thing, because in the video game One Piece Unlimited World Red for the 3DS, we have a character who is the main antagonist of that game called Patrick Redfield. Patrick Redfield has the ability of the bad fruit model vampire, but it's a mythical zone fruit, and it's kind of like your standard movie monster. At least that's what it's trying to portray. Like he's an actual vampire, even though he's still like a weird bat creature when he transforms. And we actually get to see the devil fruit. And no, it looks nothing like the artificial devil fruit I was talking about. But it's interesting because also in that video game, he has a minion who defects called Pato. Pato is a pen that has eaten the dog fruit model Bakai Danuki, which is just a yokai that's a tanuki, a yokai raccoon dog. The reason why this ties back to Stussy is because Stussy is a canon character who has vampire bat powers. Patrick Redfield is a non-canon character who has vampire bat powers in an off-brand way, even though his powers are mythical. But Pato, even though he's a pen that has eaten a tanuki fruit, we then, in the manga, have another character who is an object, in this case a teapot, who has eaten a very similar fruit. But much like with Stussy, this character, whose name is Banbuku, is a character who has eaten the real-life version of the mythical creature. He just has a normal tanuki fruit. It's called the dog fruit model tanuki. So I just found that very interesting that in both cases we have two canon characters who have the real life animal variant of the devil fruit, and then we have the video game characters who are in basically the same situations with a pen eating the mythical version of the tanuki fruit, and then we have a guy eating the mythical version of the bat fruit. I just wanted to point that out because I thought it was very interesting. Now, on top of that, I think based on what goes on in Egghead, because in Kuma's flashback, we see that he does become a warlord, but he becomes a warlord through Saturn's arrangements, not through getting a messenger bat who sends him the invitation, which most likely means that based on the time this is set in, we see that Stussy is fairly young and hasn't really come into her own yet as a clone. So most likely she hasn't started doing her government espionage work yet. So it's likely that Stussy is actually the messenger bat that gives all the warlords their invitations, because we find out when Jinbei gets his invitation and when Buggy gets his invitation, they are both delivered by what seems to be a vampire bat, because as you may or may not know, vampire bats have like a weird pig-like nose. That same nose that gives the bat the quote-unquote infrared vision. Yeah, those noses look like that of a pig's nose. And from what we've seen of the messenger bat, it has a pig's nose. So most likely that is a vampire bat. And that vampire bat, I think, is Stussy. You can even see too, it has sharp teeth. Even though they do have sharp teeth, that's sort of just like a cartoon stylization thing, but it's still important. And in an odd way, it would make sense for a vampire bat to be a messenger to a warlord, because if you think about it, and you think about the world of One Piece, it would be very easy for a bat, especially if this bat is Stussy, to pick up on people because it can see in infrared. So if a person is on a boat or in the jungle, whatever, they can most likely pick up on their heat signature and their silhouette using their infrared vision if this bat is Stussy and she's using what she does in the anime to actually see whom her target is. It makes a ton of sense. It also allows her to most likely blend in into locations, because a bat in itself is just kind of a mundane animal. So for espionage work, it makes a lot of sense as well. However, getting back to the Kuma flashback, we don't know how old Stussy is yet, but seeing as how she's coming to terms with herself being a clone of somebody else, it's fair to say that she's still fairly young, which most likely means, given that Saturn gives Kuma his warlord invitation and not a bat, so most likely that means she hasn't become the messenger pat for the warlord system just yet. So that's why I'm saying that this kind of ties in well together, because we've only seen warlord invitations be given out in the current timeline after the fact of which she's created, and she's like a full working agent. So that sort of strengthens the idea that she is indeed the messenger bat that gives out the warlord invitations. What's also very funny about this thought of Stussy being the invitational bat for warlords is that, as you know, Stussy is a clone of Miss Bucking. Miss Bucking's supposed son, Edward Weevil, became a warlord. So, in a way, she got to see her little brother, apparently, when she gave him the warlord invitation, if all this is to be believed. I guess that would be her little brother, I'm not sure, or her nephew, I guess. I don't know how clone genealogy works in that way. What's also kind of interesting, but I don't know if this is real or not, but in the flashback for Orochi back in Wano, we see that the Kurozumi grandmother, who had the clone fruit at the time, turned into both Shiki and a blonde woman. This blonde woman could have been the original Stussy. And this is a little extra theory for you, but what if Miss Bucking's actually the mother of Yamato? Because it's super weird that she would turn into two people who bear some resemblance to folks that were on the Rocks crew, that being a very young Shiki and supposedly a very young Miss Bucking. What's also very interesting is that she seemed to be more worldly than your average Wano inhabitant, because she knew what dove fruits were, because she presented Orochi with the Yamato no Orochi fruit, and she does have a very sort of close relationship with Kaido and was responsible for his victory over Odin. So all I'm saying is that she could have been on the Rocks crew with Kaido and just decided to roll with Kaido. Just saying. It also makes sense that Kaido would have the Yamato no Orochi fruit in his possession, as he did have a tendency for tracking down mythical and ancient Zoans, and he had a bunch. He's the reason why Ulti has her fruit, the reason why Page 1 has his fruit, and the reason why Yamato has her fruit. So I could see it. Makes a lot of sense. I just find that a very interesting thought. The only caveat I have to say is that the person that the clone fruit user turns into is a blonde woman with green eyes, and Stussy has been depicted with blue eyes, but we have not seen the eye color of Miss Bucking yet. So her eye color might be different than Stussy's, seeing as how she wears glasses all the time now. So we don't actually know what the color of her eyes actually is. So that's something kind of interesting to think about. So yeah, in short, I do think that Stussy was the warlord messenger bat, and she does have the artificial dove fruit that Caesar created. With that being said, give me your thoughts. So I think Stussy will be the Sally to Brooks Jack skeleton. Let me explain. So in the family dynamic of things in the Straw Hat crew, which is a bit of a trivia thing, but still something that is partially upheld, Brooke is considered the grandfather. So in this setup, if Stussy were to join the Straw Hat crew, I think she would be the grandmother, as Stussy would be the oldest female character on the crew at that point, as Robin is 30. So In Stussy being 36, as we found out in the recent Vivid Card drop, this may or may not be true. The logistics of this are very interesting, which make her very similar to Brooke because she could have been born as a child 36 years ago and being cloned, and she just grew into being 36. Or she could have been born as a clone as a 36-year-old woman and has been around for 36 years, making her 72. This is very similar to Brooke because he died as a 33-year-old man. However, based on his ability and the circumstances that he was set in, he returns back to life several years later as a skeleton, now being 88 years old. And then after the time skip, he is 91, but his soul is still 33. His body is still 33, or at least has the bones of a 33-year-old man. So with that being said, both Stussy and Brooke are in a weird sort of they're this age, but not really situation. With that being said, continuing, this could mean both of them are oddly immortal. Because of Brooke's abilities, he will live indefinitely unless his bones are severely damaged, because based on him being a skeleton, he is now beyond the need of biological processes, as his soul is the thing that keeps him in his world. With that being said too, Stussy is presumably in a similar situation, seeing as how we don't really know what the logistics are when it comes to clones and cloning. So she too could just be 36 forever. Moving forward, there are a lot of very interesting similarities between Brooke and Jack Skellington. Jack Skellington is an abnormally tall skeleton who is very musically inclined. Brooke is the same way. And two, what is very interesting about Jack's design is that not only is he a skeleton, he's a skeleton wearing a black suit, which is what Brooke wears in both of his key designs, in the pre-time skip and the post-time skip. However, Jack is wearing a bat for a tie. So this does tie Stussy to Brooke in that way, a bat and a skeleton. Those are also the two most iconic symbols for Halloween. But with that being said, the interesting case and the more, I guess, intricate case is between Stussy and Sally. Okay, so both Stussy and Sally are artificial beings. Stussy is a clone of another person, and Sally is some sort of ragdoll creature stuffed with leaves, right? Both of them are made by mad scientists. Vegapunk makes Stussy, and Dr. Finkelstein makes Sally, and they both have a daughter-father relationship with their creators, and they do both serve them in various ways. Sally does various things for Dr. Finkelstein throughout the movie, and the whole time, Stussy was working with the interest of Vegapunk. So both of them are loyal to their supposed father creator figures. With that being said, Dr. Finkelstein might have been the inspiration for Vegapunk along with Albert Einstein, because it's super weird that throughout the movie, Dr. Finkelstein has shown the ability to remove the top of his skull and mess with his brain. This too could be an inspiration for an ability of Brooks, as he too can remove the top of his skull and store things within his head. But Dr. Finkelstein does open up the top of his head and mess around with his brain constantly throughout the film Nightmare Before Christmas, until finally towards the end, Dr. Finkelstein takes half of his brain to put into a new female companion, presumably a companion that will play the role of his wife. Dr. Vegapunk, as you know, has done very similar things. Not only did he remove his brain so that it can grow indefinitely even after death, but he somehow, some way gave intelligence and personified his traits and made those 6 other different people. 3 of them being women. So I think that's how Dr. Finkelstein, Vegapunk, Sally, and Stussy all compare. And these characters presented in The Nightmare Before Christmas could have been inspirations for both Brooke and Stussy and Vegapunk. But with that being said, I think a very sweet end for Brooke and Stussy, if they are both actually immortal, if they both retire at the Twin Capes, much like how Rayleigh and Shockey have retired in Sabaody Archipelago, so that Brooke would eternally have an immortal companion that he can watch Laboon with, and I guess welcome in fledgling pirates from the various blues into the Grand Line with. I think that would be pretty neat. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Worksuit. So a little while ago, I said that Stussy would make for a great lookout based on her abilities of infrared vision that are shown off in the anime when her abilities make their anime debut. However, this video was made before her ability was officially confirmed to be the Zoan type Devil fruit called the Bat fruit. However, in another video, I correctly predicted that she would have a bat fruit, though I was a little off in saying that it would be a vampire bat fruit smile. Though I was right in saying that it was always going to be a simple animal and nothing mythical or anything like that. So we take that as a dub. Anyway, with her having infrared vision, it's also possible, seeing as how she is a vampire bat, even though the fruit is just called the bat fruit, but based on how she acts and how she performs during the Egghead arc, it's very obvious that she is a vampire bat and not like a fruit bat or anything like that. So with that being said, in being a vampire bat, not only would she have infrared vision, but she has night vision, echolocation, and a good sense of hearing and smell. So with that being said, all of these would be very valuable when the idea that she could be a possible lookout for the Straw Hat crew, combined with her ability to use observation hockey. Also, another important aspect of this is that the Straw Hats all have canonical sleep times. So possibly she could not have a sleep time, or her sleep time is reversed. So she stays up at night all the time, but sleeps during the day. This is very valuable because most of the Straw Hats are sleeping during the night. So this further lends to the idea that she would be a great lookout in the future if she does join the Straw Hat crew. With that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Works. So in some variations of popular media, it is said that vampires have the ability to become mist. I think Stussy could have an approximation of this ability. In the recent video card drop, we find out two things about Stussy. One, that she's the user of the Bat fruit, and two, she could be immortal, or at least very long-lived, as she was cloned most likely 36 years ago as a 36-year-old. The jury is still out on how old she is actually, based on the nature of her creation. With that being said, in chapter 1104, she is able to dodge Lucy with a paper arts technique called paper art after image, in which she left a version of herself behind and simply stepped through Lucy's attack. This seems to be, unlike the other paper arts techniques, a speed-based ability, as other paper arts techniques are about contortion and muscle compression, whereas this seemed to be simply moving so fast that you make the opponent believe you are in a place where you are not. So much like the supposed immortality and the ability to literally become a bat, this is yet another notch in the vampire, I guess, ability list for Stussy without actually being a vampire, which is very funny and interesting. So this is extremely impressive, especially seeing as how it's being done against a proclaimed sixth powers master like Rob Lucci. Now, this reminds me of some other techniques that we've seen from the Straw Hat Pirates, namely Nami and Brook. Brook's signature attack, 3-verse humming aeronaut slash, is very similar to paper art after image, in which it prioritizes speed, so much so that it only appears as though Brook has cut his opponent after he sheathed his sword after walking 3 meters away from the opponent, which is crazy when you think about it. So he and Stussy have that in common. Where the similarities lie when it comes to Nami is when we're talking about the various versions of Mirage Tempo, in which Nami makes the opponent think they are attacking her, but they are attacking an illusionary version of her, which becomes more and more complex as the climate tech goes up in upgrades. So with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Wax It! So this was often speculated by me, but after a recent Vivid card drop, this seems to be the case, because I often speculated that her mask that she wears as a upper echelon member of Cypherpole Aegis Zero was a reference to her ability. And it's very unique because it's the only mask that resembles an animal in any kind of way. So with the recent Vivid card drop, we do find out that she is a Zoan type Delphi user holding the Bat fruit. Now, in her being a Bat fruit user, her mask could be a reference to a type of bat called the Flying Fox, which has a very canine shaped head, and her mask is very canine in appearance. What's also further interesting about this is that even though she is a bat Zoan fruit user, she most likely is a vampire bat, as she drinks blood during the Egghead Island arc. And flying foxes are fruit bats. So she mostly resembles a fruit bat while wearing the mask, but in actuality, she is a vampire bat that drinks blood. This could speak to her being a double or a triple agent in a way, appearing to be one thing in 2 different cases, but it's actually something else entirely. I think that could be a cheeky reference to that as well, because during the Tea Party, she presents herself as a high-ranking member in the underworld. However, she's not. And then in the Egghead Island arc, she presents herself as a high-ranking member in Cypherpole Aegis Zero. However, she is not. So, yeah, that's very intricate, actually. I didn't expect to get this much out of Stussy, and that's a part of the reason why I think she's very likely to be a Straw Hat member in the future, just because so much is being put into her character, even as early as Whole Cake Island. So yeah, she's very interesting, and I can't wait to see more of her. But with that being said, give me your thoughts and tell your friends about Polypede Wax It!